Kira. So I thought we would record a little bit of a training session and just a few key components there showing you how I deliver my training, just for reference for you. There'll be a few stop-start bits, and obviously we'll be working with the San Remo Cafe Racer because we're out here in the roastery. It also may be a little bit loud, so you may hear me yelling at you, but hopefully we get all the points across. So basically when I start off the training, there's a couple of things that I like to do. Initially, a bit of a get to know each other. I think it's really important, depending on how long you've got with them, to also cover a little bit about who ACR is within the structure of CCA and how the delivery happens, and also their touch points. So make sure you know their rep, who they should go to on a local level, and we're also going to cover things like some quick troubleshooting and how to log a job. So all of that is a really nice way. You need to get to know the crew first. Really important part of that, as well as managing their expectations. So I usually ask people to tell me a little bit about themselves, their experience with coffee, if they have worked with coffee, who else they've worked with, because sometimes it gives you a bit of an indication if they say a brand that we maybe think is in the lower end, that this is going to be quite a big jump for them, and if it's at the higher end, that it will hopefully be on par with what they know, and we talk a slightly different language depending on the crowd. The other thing then is to ask them to rate their skills on a scale of 1 to 10. Just gives you a bit of an indication of where they think they're sitting. And then on top of that, then ask them what they would most like to take away from this training session. I find that's really valuable because most people jump straight to latte art, and it's a really big, important thing to manage their expectation that they don't feel, I guess, ripped off by the end of a session that you haven't covered latte art. So, for example, if latte art was to come up, I usually say, hey, today we're going to focus on going back to the basics. We're covering a lot more about our equipment, our way of making coffee, so on and so forth. There are a few tips and tricks I can give you at the very end, but I highly recommend you just practice, and I can give you a couple of videos to look at. And so that just helps to manage their expectations so that at the end you don't have people puffing when you've probably delivered a really, really good training. So once we've done all of that, the next thing that we really do is go into what I call health and safety and terminology. So it's just health and safety, terminology and troubleshooting. So I usually start with the equipment. So say we've got our grinder, for example. I'll tell them what the make and model, so I'll go Mazza, Super Jolly, electronic, and then we'll go through the parts. So we'll talk about the hopper, that's how we hold the beans, but some basic troubleshooting on the side here is the gate. Now talk about how the gate is used so that we can close the flow of beans into the grinder. That's really helpful at the end of the day when we're washing our hopper at start. On the side here, on-off switch, we call these your forks for resting your handle on. And if it's a dosing chamber with the clap, we sort of just electronic here. I always start with the hopper at the top. We talk about that's how we store our beans. We talk about the little gate at the bottom here. It stops the flow of beans going into the grinder, which is fantastic when we want to clean our hopper at the end of the night. However, it can be left in at the start of a shift, and people can be pressing the buttons and saying everything's working, but there's no ground coffee coming out. Their first reaction is to panic. Your first reaction is to tell them to open the gate. And so that's something that they can do themselves. Beneath that is the adjustment collar. We talk about this as how we change the grind, but we don't go in depth at this stage. We'll cover that a bit later on. Same with the electronic dosing pad. We talk about this as how we control the volume of grinds that are coming out. But once again, we don't go into detail until we cover it off at the time of grind change, just because all of that's linked together. Cool. Then we can, if we've got a clap one here, we will talk about the dosing chamber, and we'll talk about the dosing arm. These are the forks that you rest your handle on, and then the on and off switch here. Nice and easy. Cool. That's about all we cover there. Then we move on to our machine. And obviously I was talking to the San Remo Cafe Racer. However, you would be doing it with probably one of the Ranchilios as well. Similar principles apply, and you're pointing out similar parts here. So, I always start at one end and sort of work my way to the other. So, on this one here, I was saying we've got our steam ones here. With the ranchillo, we talk about the C lever, we talk about how old school used to twist, 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 on, twist, close, and about how there was a gradual opening of the valve. Ranchillo, as you guys will know, was made with a lot of ergonomics in mind, and so one of those was the steam wand. So now we have just an open and closed valve. And so when we press down, we're purging and releasing it and turning it on, but as soon as we let go, it stops. And then like when we're steaming milk, we flick it up and it stays on as we're steaming our milk, allowing us to have our hand free to feel the temperature of the milk that we're steaming and to steady the milk jug. Obviously really important at that stage to point out that with your steam wand, the metal gets hot, there is a rubber part on there to move it with or to use a cloth. Also when you are releasing any steam like this, that it's always pointing down into the drip tray as steam burns are quite nasty. Then you move along, you've got your hot water tap. You might talk, depending on which model you've got, it may be a twist or it may be a button and it may be two buttons, and about how those are programmable for different doses of water. Just a nice thing to be able to cover for them because it's a nice little customization that you can do before you leave that makes them feel like they got a little extra out of it. Moving on to our group heads, obviously these ones are quite complex here, but we talk about group heads as a whole. So when I first introduced the machine, I would say this is a San Remo Cafe Racer 2 group, and then I break that down and so it doesn't sound like a big lot of jargon. I'll say the make is a San Remo, the model is a Cafe Racer, and 2 group refers to the fact that we have 2 heads. If it had 3, it would be a 3 group, if we had 1, it would be a single group. And that just allows people to start to understand and break down what can sometimes sound quite confusing. Lots of people just refer to it as a coffee or barista machine and haven't really thought about the make or model before. When we're talking around the group head, I always point out, obviously, that under here is very hot, and with a Cafe Racer, if you're doing a training with a Cafe Racer, all of this is extremely hot, so definitely important to point out. But I talk about going into some of the parts that are underneath that group head because they don't really ever get to see it. And so the main points that I point out are the rubber seal and about how rubber expands when it's hot and contracts when it's cool. And that is one of the reasons that we keep our handles in there, to keep it nice and supple all the time. I also talk about the mesh that's here that stops any of the coffee particles from going up into the machine and blocking any jets. And that we need to purge in between each of our shots, which is going to allow us to release some of that that's there, but also that as we move on we'll talk a little bit about cleaning and keeping that clean throughout. And I also talk about keeping our handles in there for another reason. And the reason I really bring this up quite a lot is that we're wanting to make sure that the customers are understanding reasons why. And so I will sometimes at the start of my training preface that my training all revolves around why. And that is partially for me that my years in hospitality, I had many managers that told me to do things but didn't give me the reason why. Once I understood the reason why, it became a lot more common for me to actually do it, to follow through and to not cut corners. And so when you do that, you're also giving them license to ask you why if they don't understand something. So I find I get a lot of interaction with customers through that. Cool. So one of the big fallacies that people believe is leaving their handles out of the machine. So we talk about it for 2 main reasons. One is that we're keeping that rubber seal nice and supple. And remembering if they push down, why does that matter as well? That rubber seal, if it doesn't seal up perfectly with the top of your basket here, that's when we get leaks of water around the outside. If it cracks, leaks of water around the outside, and we're changing the pressure and the extraction rate at which it goes through. Now, when it comes to the handle also, I often use the analogy of brewing up a pot of tea. Okay, if you've got a ceramic teapot and you don't preheat the teapot, the water you're using to brew your tea will actually be significantly lower than the water that you're adding to the teapot. And that's because the ceramic will take a lot of that heat. Now, the same thing happens when brewing coffee in little 30-second increments, right? If our handle and basket are cold, the initial temperature of the water is going to be absorbed into the metal to heat that up to a temperature, before then it continues brewing. So we talk a lot about consistency in making coffee, and that's one of the ways that we can make sure we have a consistent approach to our extractions. Well, as we're moving further along here, we just sort of talk through some different parts. So we talk about brew head, we talk about the volumetric buttons, being able to deliver a certain volume of water that we program in there. We talk about baskets, handles, lugs or ears, and spouts. Okay. Now, I always at this stage, because you tend to start overloading them a bit with information, make a joke that there is no test at the end of it. But it is important that you see them being engaged with this, because they can start to switch off, and depending on your crowd, they may either be really interested in those finite details, or they may not be interested at all, in which case just sort of speed and start skipping over a few things a bit more. But things that you really do need to point out is obviously then you just sort of say your steam ones and your other group head are exactly the same. You point out the power button, so you know on a Rancilio it could be underneath or up here. And we need to point out the boiler switch and the cup warmer. And the reason being that we need to tell them that there is nothing wrong with the cup warmer, we have disabled them. And so it doesn't matter if that switch is on or off, which means that in my policy I'm telling them that all switches on the machine should be on. It's a lot easier than remembering which ones are on and which ones should be off. Cool, and the boiler, letting them know that that's a really basic troubleshooting one as well. They can come in and they might not have any steam or hot water, but they have cold water coming through the group heads. That means the machine can be fully operational, but someone may have gone to the boiler switch. Okay, you tell them to turn that on within 20 minutes to half an hour, and they should have the machine up and running again. And lastly would be that power button. It seems really, really basic, but just informing them that that obviously can be knocked, and that might be a reason why their machine isn't working the next day. Cool. Right, so following on from the terminology around the equipment, we do also talk about one last sort of step in any of the troubleshooting as well, which is referring them to the sticker that has our 0800 number on it and also has the code that they will need for logging a job. We talk often, I think people go straight to reps with these problems, and then the reps are just doing exactly what they could have skipped a step and done themselves. So the 0800 Coca-Cola and have those numbers ready. Someone will be there to log a job for you. Then someone will go into the SLA agreements. So up to you how you want to handle that with your individual customers, but for me I find it really beneficial to give them that control, because it means that it takes out a middle step. You never know if you're in the middle of an hour and a half training, it might get around to it, that sort of thing. Well, some last little bits to touch on is just to make sure that they're all familiar with the same terminology for things that you're going to use. And so you sort of talk about just the brush that you have for cleaning up your grinds, you have a tamp mat, you have your cloth setup, so a cloth specifically for your steam wand, and another one just to wipe down. Talk about how ideally there'd be different colours, and then you have your dump bin and a dry cloth there for drying out your baskets. That for me rounds out that sort of part of the training, and then you start to you take a little break, ask them if they've got any questions, and then power on into espresso, which is mostly that theory based around recipes at this stage. Awesome. So once we've gone through all the terminology, troubleshooting, anything that comes up in that way, we then move on. And so depending on the group, the amount of time you have, depends on if you go all the way back to origin and processing and all those sorts of things, or quite often we're doing concise trainings on site, and so we don't have that sort of level of time. And so we'll move into theory, essentially. And so we want to talk about consistency. And so I usually ask people, do you drink coffee? Hopefully most of them do, sometimes you get a few that don't. But we talk about one of the most frustrating things being you can go up and have a fantastic coffee at a cafe. You can even order a second one in that same cafe visit and it can be terrible. And quite often it's just because the barista doesn't have the comprehension. They have the ability to make great coffee, but whether they understand how or why they've made that great coffee is what we want to dig into today and give them that knowledge. And so we talk about the tools that we have around that. We talk about scales if we have those with the customer. But even if we don't have them with the customer, I tend to use scales during a training and talk about the accuracy so that we're giving them an aspiration of things to move towards. Now, so talk about recipes to begin with. So whatever blend you've got, you sort of talk about the recipe that we have there. We talk about why we have recipes, right? So there's a consistency angle, but there's also the fact that someone out here at the roastery has come up with these recipes. And they've done it through a lot of trial and error, and you can sort of joke about like over a whole day it can take to come up with one recipe. It truly can take that long. And we talk about then the extraction process and the flavours are brought out at different stages. So depending how you want to do this, there's a very basic way of just doing an under-extracted coffee, a well-extracted coffee, and an over-extracted coffee. And people can taste that. The other one is that we do it in parts, where we run out under a double group heat. We run off two different sides essentially. And we're sort of putting this one away around 10-15 seconds, replacing it with another for the next 5 seconds, so on and so forth. And then we've got all the components broken down. Now in the post-COVID world, I found it really hard to do this if my groups if I'm not doing individual trainings and I'm doing groups. You just have to work out how you want to do that, what the time is. It's a hugely beneficial part of the actual training because we're able to explain how an extraction works in under and over extraction. So with the over and under extraction, then people are able to comprehend what the difference is between a sour, salty coffee, a well-extracted coffee, and an over-extracted coffee. Because in New Zealand we tend to use the term over-extracted as an all-encompassing word for bad coffee. This is then skilling them up in some terminology about how that works. Now, one of the big things within that as well is explaining that we have a window. So we have an actual recipe, but we accept human error and the fact that we're not infallible, right? And so what we need from that is to let them know that window and let them know why that's acceptable. We also need to talk about how we need all of those flavours that are extracted in our flavour of coffee. So it's not that the salt or umami flavour or the acids are bad, it's that on their own they're bad. We need it all well rounded to be able to create the flavour that we know is espresso. Cool, so once we've talked about consistency and recipe, one of the big things is then talking about grind size. Now, I always make sure that the team are really engaged at this stage because it's one of the key things you want them to take away is how to effectively change the grind. So, if you notice the guys are sort of wavering attention or you see them kind of with their phones out and about, you sort of like, hey guys, let's take a quick 5 minutes. I'm going to come back and really focus because this is the key component as a barista to making consistent coffee. So, say you did break, you come back. The big thing is talking about grind size, talking about the adjustment collar, how it works, talking about, we've already done the taste on why it's important that it fits in that window. So then we start throwing out some scenarios and we talk about rocks and sand and one of my things that I do is I will constantly throw it to a different person in the group. If I'm pouring 20 seconds and I want to be at 28, which way do I change the grind? And I will then do highs and lows and all sorts. And people get kind of sick of it, but I guarantee you by the end of it they remember which one it is. And on top of that, whatever their answer is, you always question them with why. You don't say whether they're right or wrong yet, you ask them why. And them having to justify what it is starts to cement in their brain a little bit more that, oh wait, actually no, not coarse, I want to make it finer because I want to slow it down, etc, etc. Talking about that, making sure that we do sort of the rule of 3 in terms of you best of 3 shots before you change anything, not changing something immediately. Also then when you change the grind, making sure that we're grinding as we change so that we don't trap any beans. we also want to make sure that we're never changing more than one notch at a time, and that we are essentially wasting 3 shots of coffee before we will see the change. Then it's really important to cover macro versus micro adjustments. It's really important as we go through this that we don't seem to be encouraging wastage, both from a cost perspective for the for our customer, but also just as a general thing, right? The coffee's gone through an amazing journey and a lot of work, and we want to make sure that it's, I guess, being treated with respect as we go through it. And we unfortunately do waste a lot of coffee during a training process. So some of the suggestions that I have around that is you can extract those shots anyway that aren't any good, and you can keep them off to the side and use them in baking. So you can suggest mocha slices, espresso cake, those sorts of things. You can also super sweeten them up and maybe use them in a pre-mixed iced coffee that you get the guys to make. So there are ways that these guys can use the product, but what we're really trying to drill into people here is that a consumer is coming in and paying a premium amount every day for this coffee with you. How can you help to make sure that that money feels well spent and to keep them coming back? Cool, so talking about quality but not having to waste products. The same happens when we get around to milk, and we talk about not reusing milk. I talk about how we can pour any leftover milk into a container. We can go to the kitchen for things like muffins and scones and cheese sauces and those sorts of things. There's nothing wrong with the milk, but we don't want to reheating it at the coffee machine level. Okay, so once we talked about changing the grind, we show them how to make a grind adjustment. We're throwing all those questions out there at them. What I tend to do is get everyone to come up and make a shot. So we talk around barista technique, and which you guys know all about. So talk them through all of the steps, actually make it an espresso for them. So talking through each step of the way, showing them why we clean it out, why are we doing a dry basket, why are we doing, and once again just honing in on the why for everything. And at this stage you tend to get quite a few questions from people around things that maybe they've been taught before. It's also a really good opportunity to make sure we talk about why we don't knock the basket anymore. And what I sort of really stress here, and I think is really important to land a really good point with these guys, is we keep learning things about coffee. So coffee is not, we still don't know everything, right? And we're still learning more. So there might be things that we teach you at this training that in 3 years' time we go back and we change. But we are delivering the most information that we have, or the most accurate information we have at the time. And so we're talking about tapping the basket and things. It's about talking about how we used to think that that was right, and now why we think that tapping it isn't correct. So really stressing those things. Don't dismiss anyone's theories, because generally they've come from a good place, and you still need to keep getting their buy-in as we keep going into the training. Cool. Once everyone sort of gets an opportunity to come up, that's the really key point, to be really interested in them as an individual. So it can be really easy to get sidetracked by the rest of the group. I always preface at the start, if I can, and just say, hey guys, so we'll each come up, you guys can chill out over here on your phones in the meantime, or you can watch what's going on, but I'll be up at the machine there and I'll be giving you all the individual tips. So it might be that you're helping adjust someone's elbow as they're tamping, making them look at their extraction, or look at the puck, or look at the way that they've tamped, or they forgot to flush, any of those sorts of things. Generally what I'll do is 2 shots. Okay, and so they get the first one where you're protecting them, the second one where they're trying to make sure that they've replicated all of those bits, and then they will jump over, put their coffees off to the side, and we always try and get them to extract into the larger cup, because we're going to use the same shot in the second part when we come to the milk. If you have time and you have a bigger group or a smaller group and more time, one of the exercises that I really like to do is we get them pouring and practicing at this stage. Then I'll come over and I'll mess up the grinder, and they as a team have to work out how they should be fixing that problem and give you all of the reasons for why and how they're going about that. It really helps them, as a team, to come together, and I talk about this as them needing to ensure that they are troubleshooting in the right way and helping each other out during that process. Rightio, once we've completed everything around grind size and given them the exercise, it can be another good idea to take a wee break. I'm a big fan of taking short breaks to keep everyone focused during these trainings, especially if you don't have very long with them. You tend to be speaking at a very high rate and they can become disengaged. So keep on top of that, make sure you're looking after your group at the same time. But the next stage is talking about milk. Now milk is really all about practice, and it can be quite frustrating for your group if you don't have very long with them, that they don't feel like they get enough time in. And so it's something that before you even do your trainings, you can chat with the manager about, hey, I can only be with you for an hour and a half, but I highly suggest that the team have an hour afterwards where they can play around on the machine and practice the things that they've learned. Can be a really good way to go about it if you're under time pressure, or if they don't have the time. It's a good opportunity for you to be able to recommend that they are over the next few days following up on some practice. So obviously with milk, you know how to teach milk, coming over, touching on the health and safety parts again, making sure you're giving some tips and tricks on how to do it, some stretching. Quite often questions will come about the different style of drinks. One of my lines now, I guess, is that what traditional coffee beverages were is not really what they are anymore, and that has come about through customization. And so rather than getting caught up in, I guess, like a little bit of a battle around, is this truly what a cappuccino is or truly what a flat white is, I sort of say in New Zealand everything is standard double shot. Your flat white, latte and cappuccino are a slow progression in microfoam volume. However, in New Zealand now we've really customised beverages, so you can get a large flat white single shot, which never was an option. And so we're in a customisable world, basically just trying to create a fantastic silky smooth milk and creating that flavour profile that people are looking for, rather than getting caught up into those arguments. And if someone does, you guys know the basics anyway, and you can chat through that. Now, when it comes to milk and you get them steamed, they've got their 2 shots off to the side. First thing that we want them to do is generally do a, if you've got time, do a shot with cold water and add a little bit of dishwashing liquid or hand soap, and both of those will then react the same as milk. It's also a fantastic way for their first one. You can see how deep and exactly where their steam wand is pointing, and they get to see that visual representation before they've got opaque milk in there and they can't do it. It's also fantastic to point out to them that they can do this without wasting products and practicing their milk skills. Now, once they've done that, first 2, generally, I'm there guiding, helping both as they're steaming, making sure, watching them, giving them some tips and tricks. Third one, I say go for it themselves. The same happens with the pouring approach for 1 and 2, and then the second is, 1 is just steaming, throw away the soapy water. Second one, you guiding them at the back. And one of the big things that we are working on when we're talking here is the pouring, going in, pour, swirl a little bit, blending a little bit of the milk sweetness with the bitterness of the crema. And then we're also going to start pouring in the middle, coming up high, blending over the white, coming down, and this is the part where we begin to release the foam and be able to draw. The closer the spout is to what we're drawing on here will give you better clarity on what you've got. But as we come down, this movement here is the angling. However you want to describe that, I describe it sometimes as a bit of a seesaw movement, but the closer you get in to the liquid that you're pouring on, the easier and better the pattern will draw. Cool? So initially everyone wants to do more than what they're probably capable of. Convince them that being able to do a blob will turn into a love heart, will turn into a tulip stack, will then turn into them being able to understand how to do a roasted milk. So it is definitely a progression thing. There are very few people who start out and just magically pour a rosetta. It does happen, but it's very few and far between. So with all of that in mind, it's really important at this stage to be drilling them around practices, right? So as they're steaming, did they purge in the first place? Did they purge afterwards? Did they wipe it down straight away? They get really excited about what's going on, and so they can become quite distracted. It's a really important part to keep them regimented and keep them accountable to each other as well. And as they're pouring and finish up, make sure that they are cleaning up the area and rinsing the milk jugs for the next person. Once again, just teaching them good practices as we go through. So finally, one of the things that we need to make sure, and it's so important, and you probably get questions throughout the training around burnt coffee. One of my favourite facts for you is that you can't actually burn the coffee with the equipment that we give them. It doesn't go hot enough to burn the coffee. And so the burnt flavour comes from an unclean machine or an over-extracted coffee. So there are ways that you can give it burnt flavours, but people so easily dismiss the burnt as something that the machine did. Cool. So obviously you know all the parts that need to be cleaned. I take them through the cleaning cycle on the Ranchillo, and one of the biggest things that I drive home is the amount of cleaning chemical. And make sure, the majority of the time they'll go, oh, we put way more than that in. It's really important and this is what I stress to them, when it goes into the machine, it's really important that we aren't using that much, but that we're doing it every day. When we're soaking handles and all of those sorts of things, that's fine. Use as much as you like because we're able to wash that away. We can't do that within the machine, and too much of that cleaning chemical can and will eat away at little parts of the machine and little components. Then when that breaks, and this is the scare factor that I always throw in there, I say that's thousands of dollars, and it will be charged onto you because that is user error, because I'm telling you not to do it now. And that is usually giving them a bit of like perspective that how serious it is, because once again, using that why tactic, people will not do it if they think that it might come back on them. Now obviously one of the big things that I stress is around the hopper, making sure we're talking about the oils. There's nothing wrong with coffee oils, but like any oil begins to turn rancid. Once it turns rancid, I use the analogy of the fruit bowl, where if there's a bad piece of fruit, it begins to turn the rest of the fruit much quicker. So it'll do the same, and that can happen with the beans, and quite often you will come in and you'll see that they haven't cleaned it in ages, and it's just reinforcing the reason why they need to do that. Also in terms of cleaning it, I say hot soapy water, always non-abrasive, so just using a J-cloth, Chuck's cloth, and hot soapy water, rinsing it with hot water and leaving it out to dry overnight rather than trying to dry it, just because it's an awkward shape, and it saves time. So giving them practical ways to do these things. Cool. Other than that, with the grinder, it's wiping down, no cleaning chemical, nothing wet inside of any components. Dry cloths are fine. Cool. And if you do use something wet, using something dry straight after. Machine, you're taking them through the cleaning cycle, you're making sure they're using the right amount of cleaning chemical, you're making sure that they know exactly the steps that need to be done. I have had a couple of people actually record me doing it, but I always get one of the team, whoever's most likely to be closing, to actually come up and press the buttons themselves and to do the process themselves. That way they really know what they're getting into. Obviously then we're talking about soaking the handles, etc, etc. You guys know all the rest of that. But really driving home cleaning chemical, really driving home how we clean the hopper, really driving home keeping the beans in an airtight container. Obviously one of the questions comes around the beans that are left in the grinder there. In an ideal world they would come out. What we're saying though is that we're using the first couple of shots to season our machine first thing the next day, and so those beans don't matter so much. We're going to use them and we're not going to serve them to anyone anyway, so they don't need to be kept in an airtight container. After that, obviously, it's all about aesthetic. I talk about the cost of the equipment quite a lot to help them realise that what they're working with isn't something that's just given to them willy-nilly. It is something that costs quite a lot of money and retains ours. So I quite often, affectionately refer to it as my baby. I look forward to coming back and seeing how you've looked after my baby. Obviously the soaking, making sure you don't soak your handles overnight. The cleaning chemical only works with boiling water, so take it out of the machine or out of the zip, whatever you need to do. Otherwise the chemical doesn't begin to work, and so sometimes people can say, oh I soak them every night, but they just use hot water out of the tap. So that's a really good flag to catch up on. And also other people used to soak them overnight. We're giving them 2 reasons why not. Number 1, we want our handles in the machine, keeping those seals nice and supple, which is a nice lift factor to the beginning. But also, secondly, that cleaning chemical stops working after about 20 minutes, so it'll be an absolute waste of time. You're just sitting it around in dirty water. Cool? So, other than that, I use this time to get the whole team to help clean this up. Or if you've got a real skeptic in the team about it taking too long, I do quite often take it as a challenge, and I'll say start your timer now, and can generally complete the whole process in 20 to 22 minutes. Cool? And so that's really taking away their power where they believe that what you're asking of them is too much. It can be a really good challenge. You go, challenge accepted, go. And yeah, I think those are most of the tips that I can give you around it all. Make sure when you finish up, I always give them, I always say thanks so much for their time. I think that there's a lot of training within the hospitality realm that is just done and ticked off, and if you can have a good reputation for a great training, next time that you come there to do a training, people will actually be putting up their hands and excited to come along. And I've had repeat customers come again being like, oh, I really didn't take it in, or I really enjoyed the first one but felt like I missed some bits. So you can go a really long way by just leaving a really lovely taste in everyone's mouth.